I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of what I was doing before moving to Vancouver, and then go into some of my studio projects, and then try to make some, give you some recommendations and sort of ideas for pursuing your own work and on your own projects. So first, with where I am right now. I'm at Emily Carr, which is on Granville Island, and my appointment is in design, and I got this Canada Research Chair position in Design and Media Arts, and it allows me to pursue research. And actually, the appointment at this is kind of a new thing for art and design schools to get these things. So me and somebody that I work with were the first to get these at an art and design school in Canada. And so part of what I'm doing is just trying to figure out how you do, what does it even mean to do research at art and design school? Or how does studio practice and building stuff interact with things like, you know, studying culture and technology and this sort of thing. I won't go into what Canada Research Chair thing is, but it gives me some flexibility to kind of pursue these questions. So before this, I was in just south of LA at a place, well, a couple places. One was Art Center, and advising students in a program called Media Design. And this was a program based, largely studio, but also writing based, focused around how do you build technology for kind of an unpredictable future. So kind of experimental design. And at the same time, I had been working as an artist in residence and research scientist in the Department of Informatics. Now, can anybody tell me what informatics is? It's kind of, in some circles it's kind of well known, but on a larger scale it's kind of like a not too widely distributed or known term. Anybody know what informatics is?
Bioinformatics is kind of like...
Yeah, there's bioinformatics. But yeah, bioinformatics is kind of like really different than what I think of informatics. Informatics, at least for the people that I worked with there, tended to define it as people and culture and technology, but much more on the like design and research end, but housed in computer science as opposed to information studies. I mean, and bioinformatics is kind of a whole separate thing. So I was at UC Irvine in informatics and had done some work with Sylvia Lintner here, studying, doing ethnographic type of work, looking at how hacker spaces work. And we were looking at differences between hacker spaces and also looking at open source hardware in China and issues of intellectual property. So what does it mean to have an open source like object or thing, or how does innovation, intellectual property, and this stuff come together when you're dealing with something like open source hardware? I'd also been doing some work, and this is more wearing my hat as a research scientist as opposed to the artist in residence. I was also doing work with electronics and looking at how hands-on instruction, kind of like constructivist type of manipulation and learning electronics changes perceptions of kids' idea that they can intervene and act in technology. And actually, Gentry, I met Gentry, I think we first met when I was doing a similar workshop at USC in Institute for Multimedia Literacy. So I've done this workshop, but the funding was to do it with kids. I did some work there. I was also working with Jeff Bowker and a bunch of other fantastic people there, and figuring out how culture and technology work together. And a number of different research groups. What happens to your Facebook account when you die? And I'd initially gone to UC Irvine for an interdisciplinary MFA in arts, computation, and engineering. But I ended up staying and doing a PhD with Mark Poster. So that's kind of my connection to the C theory and this. So that's how I kind of like come back here. But before that, and my interest in DIY culture in general really comes out of me. My dad is a mechanical engineering prof at University of Saskatchewan, now retired, and I spent time in the summers there out at the farm. So in a lot of ways, my interest in DIY culture kind of has a rural kind of background. And I have an uncle, and lots of other people would do this, is cobble together different technologies, and usually it was mechanisms that were designed to like make farming more efficient or whatever. There were sort of these Frankensteinian devices around that were welded together when I was a kid, and they really sort of captured my imagination and doing things like building go-karts as a kid and this sort of thing. So for my studio work, I was always very uneasy with the idea of sort of seamlessness, virtual reality, less sort of screen-based stuff, and much more interested in mechanical stuff. And I sort of blamed that on Saskatchewan, but also being skeptical of the idea of digital culture being completely kind of ephemeral. So the idea of, I was always much more interested in in sort of the mechanical end. So anyhow, for the studio type of work that I've done, this was in 1994. This is a drawing machine that I was really interested in, and this was sort of in the era of hypertext and Mosaic and the early Netscape and this type of stuff. Very interested in this idea of remote people connecting to a computer, and it was kind of like stepping back and thinking like, that's kind of crazy that I put something online and that somebody in a very distant location can click on it and like view it. So I was thinking, like, wouldn't that be kind of interesting to take that kind of concept and have it like channeled out into physical kind of form? It's really interesting thinking of people pulling bits of data, but it would be kind of cool to have a physical kind of output to that stuff. So I started working with trying to build a drawing machine that people could control online. And so for me, this was like kind of like trying to expose the guts of the activity of the internet, making the invisible visible. And also worked with, just disassembling electronics. So this is also early, mid-90s. And I started working with, thinking about web servers as like objects. So thinking of the idea like of somebody entering on a computer that, there's sort of like a presence that's coming there, getting data off of a thing. And that led me into, so from that drawing machine into developing and using very small web servers and thinking of them as like things that, people kind of momentarily inhabit, but really as objects. And so I had built this, and this is actually curated by, oh no, it wasn't curated by Bruce Grenville, who's in Vancouver, but different devices that, this is a body of a dead fly that I found in in some lights. You know, I took the fly and there's a server here that when people connected to this server inside of this body, that it made a little light, you know, to sort of like signify that this like, sort of like reanimating this thing, or like thinking of a new kind of body for a server. And then this is another project where I had a computer system inside of a preserved frog specimen that you could log in and then have the legs twitch and move. In this case, I was interested kind of in the history of electricity, galvanism, you know, animal electricity, animal magnetism, the idea of electricity being kind of a fluid of life from the history of science and technology, and kind of interested in bringing that together with the interest in kind of excitement over the internet. The jumping frog legs led to literature like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and other kind of stuff in that era. I'm not sure if I'm speaking to, you know, a whole bunch of Victorian scholars, and this is totally like obvious, but and this, if you look at my work and think of like bugs and icky stuff like at a farm, it kind of like makes a little bit more sense. I then had a period of work where I worked with cockroaches. And actually I was thinking through, as I was coming here, I drove by the bug zoo here, and I thought, I wonder if it's those bugs, because I developed this just a couple years after I was at that bug zoo. So maybe it's the bug zoo's fault that I developed this. I built these backpacks for these insects. These are these big Madagascan hissing cockroaches that they could walk around and take video. So part of this was thinking about developing kind of non-human technologies. I mean, at this point, I wasn't really doing like post-human, but it's definitely influenced by that sort of thinking. This is a project called Cockroach Controlled Mobile Robot. I'll show a video about it, but just very briefly before I show the video, insect is put on top of a modified trackball, like a computer mouse, with a lightweight ping pong ball that the insect can move. And so when the insect walks on this thing, the whole mechanism moves. I'll show a video about it that explains it in more detail.
Cockroach-controlled mobile robot is an experimental robotic system that uses a live insect as the controller or driver of a three-wheeled robot. The robot is controlled by a giant Madagascan hissing cockroach, about 5 centimeters or 2 inches in length. The insect is placed on top of a modified computer trackball with an adjustable harness that helps the insect stay on top of the ball. The ball operates like a 2-axis treadmill that controls the motion of the larger robot. As the cockroach moves forward on the ball, the robot moves forward. If the cockroach scurries to the left, the robot moves to the left. If the cockroach scurries to the right, the robot moves to the right. The robot also features a navigation and sensor system to help the insect avoid smashing the robot into nearby objects. An array of distance sensors looks out in front of the robot. When an object is a few feet in front of the robot, the sensors detect the object and shine lights toward the insect from the direction of the obstacle. Banks of small lights are positioned around the front of the cockroach in an attempt to build an immersive virtual environment. Since cockroaches tend to avoid light, the insect should, in theory, turn into the dark and therefore steer the robot away from obstacles. This project is inspired by three key influences. First, biomimetics, an approach to technological development that looks toward living organic systems as a source of inspiration. Specifically within the field of robotics, cockroaches are admired and used as models for the navigation logic and physical construction of mobile robotic systems. Second, the cyborg. Popular culture appears to have a recurring interest in the human-machine and animal-machine hybrid. This project strives to construct a literal cybernetic organism that plays in and off of cultural and scientific visions of synthetic and organic hybridity. Thirdly, the computational and biological. This project, in essence, is a robotic system in which the computer-based microcontroller is replaced by a biologically based insect. In the process, the operating machine highlights key characteristics of being biological. The robot and insect display attributes like unpredictability, laziness, irrationality, and emotional response. The mobility of the robot makes the intentions of the insect legible to a wide and diverse audience. Individuals tend to watch the robot for extended periods of time, empathizing with the insect and trying to discern whether or not the organism is controlling or being controlled by the technology, and whether it's aware of, immersed in, or pleased by its synthetic and mediated environment.
So, the project for me was just really sort of thinking about robotics in a lot of ways, and sort of like, I had seen a lot of work in robotics where there was this kind of like intent interest on making robots with legs and that mimicked biological systems. So for me, it was kind of like, well, if these insects are so great, how about taking this thing that you're abstracting and use like the real thing? It's kind of like a move, like almost like a McLuhan type of flip, where you extend that thing beyond where it's normal. You take it kind of to an extreme, and you kind of push it into an area that's almost like a satire. But I think as you develop satire, really kind of, well, and it's not just satire because it's a real kind of functioning thing, it ends up emulating the real world more than, you end up being more similar to the thing that you're commenting on. Another project is this. This is it's an arcade cabinet from 1986, this 8-bit driving game. That I used to like to play as a teenager. And it combines it with a real working vehicle. So it's like a driving video game that you actually drive. It has a golf cart, drivetrain. It's all highly customized. There's a computer vision system here that looks in front of the car and tries to find roads. And then there's a custom-built piece of software that tries to make the real world look like the 8-bit kind of video game world. So it's kind of like augmented reality, but like a 8-bit Sega game. You know, I'll show a video about it.
Hi, I'm Garnet Hertz. I'm a research scientist in informatics. the project started with thinking, what would it be like if this driving arcade game could actually drive? Well, there's a custom piece of software, actually a number of pieces of software that run here, that look in front of the car, try to interpret what features there are in front of the car. In this case, it looks specifically for roads, and then it draws that road shape in the style of the original video game. So this software that's running looks like the old video game, but it's actually an augmented reality type of system that tries to make the real world look like a video game from the 1980s.
I'm Walt Scocchi. I'm the research director for the Center for Computer Games and Virtual Worlds here at the University of California at Irvine. At this point, it's more of an exploration, it's an experiment, but one of the things that's starting to arise from it is whole new ways of thinking about how game-based virtual worlds can be embodied into physical devices in order to create new experiences. And one of the things that may come from the Outrun project are new ways of associating, say, game-based therapies for people who might be limited to electric chair-assisted mobility. So, like kids who are have limited ability, quadriplegic or what have you, may be able to take advantage of some of this technology if we can get it embodied in, rather than the form of an arcade machine, also in the form of a powered wheelchair. So that's something, an exciting follow-on that we see to this project.
It is a bit of an unconventional project, and I think it's a testament to the atmosphere and creativity of UCI and computer science that something like this can be done, and something that can be done that really has never been done like this before. So for me, it's an exciting place to be and to work, that I can do work like this.
And actually, something that's funny that has come up with this project since releasing it is that Sega released a video game where, I mean, it was just me doing this without the authority of Sega, and just sort of having fun and hacking around with it, you know, case mod gone wrong, or extreme, you know, whatever you want to call it. But Sega ended up releasing a video game where there was a driving Outrun cabinet. So it's like I sort of reappropriated them and reverse engineered their software, and then it worked its way back into the software. So you can go like on your iPad and download this like game, and like at one of the top levels you can unlock like the driving Outrun cabinet. So it's kind of how it goes. It's me in Denmark trying not to hit a small blind child. And other projects that had to do with surveillance or looking. And right now I'm working on the idea of using phones, mobile phones, and this will be coming out this summer at the International Symposium of Electronic Art. And I'm just developing prototypes now of a safe kind of locker system to put your phones in, or kind of a group of people to put phones in to kind of like deprive you of your phones collectively. Part of this has to do with having, I have 3 teenage kids, and it's a constant struggle to, and myself, I'm totally like glued to my phone. So part of that idea of creating a distance from phones and playing around with that. This prototype kind of looks like a bomb, or it looks like a movie prop almost. I'm thinking that the finished one is going to be more maybe looking like a microwave or something, but I'm not exactly sure. Another thing, so sort of like anti-phone systems that I'm building right now. And another side of that is kind of ubiquitous phone things. So things to encourage the obsessive overuse of phones. So this is the idea. If you're in a long-term domestic relationship, and you have ever tried to use your phone in bed with your partner beside you, it often is annoying for that person beside you that you wake them up with your phone, with the light especially. So I thought, like, why not build like a tent kind of thing that you can have in your bed with you, and then like use your phone, be on Facebook or whatever, then you don't wake. See, the people, I can tell like people who have, or in this kind of relationship already, they're all laughing. So the idea is to make a thing. This is a prototype that it looks more like a bag over your head, and that's exactly what this was. I made, and I'll be making photo documentation of this. This is kind of like a tube that goes sideways that you use the phone, and you can kind of like use the phone in peace without, it sort of creates a little like phone space for you. So I'm working on those two kind of threads of like, so having fun with, and just thinking about how people use phones, and I'm interested in how it's really kind of like had an impact on everyday life, you know. Mm-hmm. So the idea of making things and making things that are things that you can think with and through. That's what I'm interested in terms of studio practice, whether that's, you call it design or art. And I've used this term, critical making. I really like this concept to kind of encompass this idea of how you make things and how it can inform critical studies, really. So this term, makers. I know there's a few people here that belong to a maker lab, so I'm assuming that you know what I mean here. But any guesses, or what do people think of when they hear the term makers? What's involved in, what do you mean by makers or maker culture? Anybody? Building things? Yes. Any sort of technologies that people have in mind when you hear the word maker? 3D printing. Yes. Knitting. Knitting. Agriculture. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, makers. I mean, of course, makers as just an English word has been around for a long time, but since around 2003, 2004, it's taken kind of a term and been carved out by O'Reilly Media through a publication called Make. And it's also been involved in hacker spaces being set up, collaborative workshops where people, share tools, and also electronics like the Arduino, 3D printing. All this kind of has a cluster of work, a cluster of technologies and practices. But really, like this publication called Make Magazine sort of co-opted a lot of this stuff that was happening already and kind of packaged it into a family-friendly publication with a lot of useful DIY instruction there, but really kind of like trying to be a very accessible magazine. And the Arduino, which is, has anybody here used Arduino? A couple people. It's a computing platform that's a very simple computing platform that allows to make interactive physical objects in a quite straightforward way. And 3D printing, of course, is kind of heralded as the crown jewel of maker culture, revolutionizing, changing the world. And of course, for people who study technology, you know that this is always the case, usually the case of new technologies, that it's promised that it, supersedes everything, it liberates everything, this is not like a new kind of concept. And then there's also things that have to do with openness that I think are interesting. This idea of things being able to be accessed. But What sometimes comes out of the maker and DIY scene are these kind of like gadgets that are kind of, or like stuff that comes out of a 3D printer. It's often just like a trinket, right? It's often just like a technical exercise. I kind of think of this as almost like engineering folk art, you know? It's like nerd folk art, where, okay, yeah, this is actually kind of clever. This isn't anything that I made. This is just a common kit that you can buy. It is clever. It's like an anti-technology technology, but it kind of makes you think like, okay, like that's kind of like cool. It's like a one-off kind of cool thing. But where do you go after you make something like this? Or with an Arduino, you make an LED blink. Where do you go after that? And this is part of what I think the term critical making can be brought in, and I've been interested in shaping that to answer those questions. So I first started this idea of making a publication that brought together stuff that I knew from media, arts practice, design, digital humanities, critical theory, and commented on this stuff. Because there's really good stuff happening in this kind of open source hardware and things like this, but it's missing stuff. So what is it missing? So I thought, well, let's look at this. You know, Make Magazine, you know, projects, and I thought, what would an alternative to Make Magazine be like? So I got out Photoshop, which is usually how I start projects. And I thought, well, let's like start with like a parody of this. So instead of make, I'll go before and after. You know, instead of technology on your time, technology on affluent leisure time. You know, military kind of project. Because there's been, you know, military funding that goes into O'Reilly magazine and all this sort of stuff. You know, join the Arduino revolution but avoid civil disobedience. You know, how to use a MakerBot to make a 3-cent piece of plastic, 101 DIY gadgets for white males, open source secret revealed, everybody just buys the kit. You know, sort of like starting out to think like, what's the maker movement lacking? So, and part of this is also knowing a lot of different terms that people had been working with. You know, values in design by, you know, Helen Nissenbaum, tactical media by Garrett Loving, near futures, you know, or just a lot of electronic media arts practice, critical technical practice, you know, adversarial design, Carl DeSalvo, critical design, critical making, Matt Ratto, reflective design, Phoebe Singers. It's like, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that really has a lot to do with making already, right? It's not like this, like, Make Magazine invented how to make things, or electronics. So part of it is thinking, you know, that these things really, it would be good to have history, theory, context, and critical reflection on this type of stuff. So not that it's all bad or all good, it's just that it's improved by bringing a context to it. And I really like this term of Matt Ratto's, where he defines and uses this concept of critical making. He's at University of Toronto. And so I put out a call for submissions, and this is also an experiment in publishing. For me, it was really an experiment in alternative modes of publishing. But I was interested in taking this stuff and seeing how this stuff commented on all this maker stuff. So I started this project in I think I did it all in 2012. What I did is I took a back of an envelope. I wrote down sort of like a dream team of people who I wanted to submit to this publication. Maybe I don't know if you've ever tried this on Facebook, but you just write down everybody who you like. I made up kind of titles for them, you know, chapter titles, and tagged people on Facebook and said, you know, this is what I'd like to see. Everybody's doing all this interesting stuff related to this, but I'd like to see you submit something to me. And what I'll do is I'll make a old school like zine in paper, and I'll distribute it for free to people. It'll be like going back to like DIY culture history a bit and looking at handmade publications. We'll do like DIY production for the publication. I thought I'll make 300 copies, just send me 2 pages or so. Do it in any, you know, you can scribble on a piece of paper, you can do whatever you want. You can experiment around with the format, but just send me stuff and I'll print it and I'll give it away. So people started sending me this stuff. I mean, I should, probably the crowd here will notice some of these names. These are pretty like established academic scholars, largely in humanities, STS, kind of circles. And they started sending me this stuff, and I started getting all this like physical like mail of packages, people just sending me all these different formats of stuff that was like either like, you know, people sending me stuff related to their childhood that they would never include in, this isn't related to childhood, but well, not directly, but, or, you know, stuff that was more controversial that they were working on as a side project, or photographs from field work, ethnographic field work that they were doing that they didn't know what to deal with, historical type of work, stuff in different languages. The idea of, for example, doing a programming language in Cree, which would have a very different concept of things, and the programming language would fundamentally need to be very, very different. You know, people just sending me stuff. I mean, I don't know even what this, I mean, I know that this is Danish, but I don't really know exactly what it says. And other people, and actually Ken Wark was one of the first to say, yeah, I'll send you something. And then after that, it was much easier to get people to send me stuff. People talking about design. And this is Albert Boardman. I don't know if any of you know Albert Boardman, a philosopher of technology, you know, scribbling out stuff and faxing me notes. And so I was like, okay, this is great. Like, I've got a bunch of interesting stuff, you know, dripping with color, and really playing around with the format, you know. I had pointed people to the idea of zines and layout and kind of experimenting around with their work, but it was really nice to see people like really take that on. Or like talking with Geert Lovink, he was like, I want this typeset in like the ugliest typeface possible. I was like, okay. That's like that's his like requirement. For him, I mean, for some people it's like, yeah, I never thought about it, but in publishing a paper, you don't typically have any say over the typeface. It's a small thing, but I think interesting to think of. So a lot of people sent stuff, you know, from all over the place. I think it was like 70 people in total submitted things to me. So I got out I actually got a photocopier. I fixed an old photocopier because it was going to cost me a fortune to print this stuff through a commercial place. So I got out paper and pen and tape and stuff to glue the stuff together. Made a whole ton of these booklets. Initially I thought I'd have, you know, a couple people send me stuff. it ended up being like 350 pages, and I split it into 10 different booklets and folded it myself, stapled it all myself, and basically folded and stapled for a full month. But that's I guess that's the trade-off for getting a whole bunch of submissions and saying you're going to do this thing. But I actually had to do it. You know, I had to the DIY part was not very enjoyable during that component of it. So printed these booklets, and it was a lot. I mean, over 100,000 pages of, like, my office was just like covered with this stuff. So that was what I did, and I gave it away to a lot of libraries and people who contributed, and they were allowed to gift it to other people. And it was also an experiment. Like, I made 300 copies, which you may think like, well, 300 copies isn't that much, but from what I kind of calculated and figured, like, if I can get this into the hands of like 300 people who actually really care about this, it's not that far off compared to like an academic press. Like an academic press publishing 1,000 copies, maybe like 5,000 copies, a couple thousand copies. Maybe, you know, when it comes down to people who really care about it, it's kind of a small audience. So this is kind of an experiment in just playing with that a little bit. And now it's all scanned and put online. You can download all the content through my webpage. And I made some sort of like more kind of bespoke, you know, aluminum covered kind of editions of it. So coming back to this idea of critical making. So I think of this as like a cluster of related practices. It's not like this is like a great brand name. I mean, it is a great brand name, but it's not like this is the only term that is useful. And this is kind of a psychotic mess, but there are a lot of different terms. This is and I need to write something to explain this, but there are a lot of different terms that are related that have different relationships to political topics, to, you know, different kinds of audiences, you know, people who emphasize making physical objects as opposed to just making maybe films or narratives. Some are future-based, some are present-based, some, you know, do illegal things, some like are more integrated with making systematic or infrastructural change. I'll write something up and I'll send you a link to it when I'm done. But it's a cluster of related kind of practices. But I think the main idea is that if you're making stuff, it makes sense to have an understanding about cultural, historical, social, critical issues. You know, you can be making stuff and using a laser cutter or 3D printer all day, but you can still be making kind of like junk, right? So it's really useful to have, for example, an informed perspective from, and you can take that from humanities, you can take it from computer science, you could take it from, you know, STS or wherever. But and the idea, and actually Matt Ratto's work focuses much more on this, that physical work and prototyping has a real enhancement. It really can act as an enhancement for extending traditional scholarship. So this idea of hands-on work is useful in, has anybody heard like terms like body storming? It's like brainstorming, but using physical objects. Different disciplines that are related to this are like participatory design in computer science. Now, this is all well and good and everything, but if you're, you know, there's probably a few grad students here that are thinking, or just people in general, how do you sort of implement this? How would I take this and how would I do like a critical type of making? So, you know, after talking to people about this, and this is a part that kind of resembles like a self-help, kind of like the 4-step method to success. But I and this isn't the only step to do it, but this is kind of an activity that I sometimes do with grad students to help them kind of like figure out where they're at with a project and how to develop it further. So I've made a 4-step methodology. And actually the workshop that I'll be doing after this, we'll be going through this with a set of cards to help facilitate this. So the main, I think one thing is that if you think of maybe engineering or computer science, sometimes you can not really step back and get a wider perspective of the values that are embedded in a discipline or a technology. This is what like STS, humanities, critical theory does. It's a stepping back from this technology and looking at it and reflecting on it. So this may be like obvious to people here, you know, given your background, but for designers, or an engineer, it's often like, well, just make it efficient, you know, make it work really well, of course, you know. But it's worthwhile to step back. So this is actually coming at it from the perspective of a studio production or object production method. So the idea here is to step back and to reconsider those assumptions and slow down and consider the biases of a system or the values embedded in a technology. So, I mean, and often you have, this is a, you know, Latour, I don't know if everybody knows this diagram. This is the idea that values are embedded into an object like a large kind of thing attached to a hotel key or a bathroom key, you know, that you have this evolution of objects that embed values. So the idea here is to is kind of this 4-step process. Before I dig into it, this comes out of a paper and is based on an expanded version of a paper by Phoebe Singers at Cornell called Reflective Design. If you're interested in reading this, it's a great paper, and I can send you the link or the paper if you want to email me. So the idea here is to identify the core metaphors of a field. Okay. So in the case of personal computing, this could be a desktop. Okay. In the case of a library, it could be an archive. In the case of, like, my robotic cockroach-controlled robot, it could be biomimetics or the insect. Okay, so you take, or in a video game, it could be immersion. You know, so you take the core, you think about the core metaphor, and this could be like for network computing, it could be like the cloud. For the internet, it could be information superhighway or whatever. Sometimes it's like a marketing slogan or term or concept, but a metaphor. And then think about what those metaphors don't include. So for example, the idea of the cloud. If you talk about cloud computing, if you just think about a cloud, what's not included in the metaphor of a cloud? What's missing from a cloud? This is an actual question.
Dirt.
Dirt. There's no dirt.
Solid structure.
Solid structure, yeah. So there's no like underwater cables really included in that metaphor of a cloud. It's very ephemeral. And these are like intentional kind of choices in constructing and building terms like this. But these metaphors, they often enhance the understanding of of certain capabilities, but they'll also exclude things. And in metaphors around technologies, you'll have things that are marginalized, like, you know, the computer desktop. You don't have like dancing being a function of or a way that you can use a computer desktop. The metaphor kind of occludes that. So then the next move is to take this metaphor and to bring that, to think about what's excluded from there and bring that into the center and basically just design around that thing. So for the example of a, you know, you can think of a human computer interface that's sort of undesktoped, right? Or in the case of a library, you could think of the unarchivable thing. Like, for example, what's something that's not included in a library archive?
Performance.
Performance. Yeah. There's no performance in an archive, or hamburgers, or microcontrol. Oh, well, there are microcontrollers in some libraries, but that's another topic. So it's kind of a thought exercise. What would a library of performance be? What would a library of notes that people pass in elementary school to each other, or maybe people just text message each other now? I'm not sure. But so build that thing. Take the marginalized thing and build that. That's basically the 4 steps. And I think another thing that comes out of this is that you have a lot of bias that emerges when you do this. For example, there are a lot of people and groups. Often, you know, women are excluded from the building technologies or systems. All sorts of different types of cultural groups, locations, and this sort of stuff. So it's important, and it can be done as like a fun exercise to think, oh, what would a library of performance be? But it also gets to sort of question like, okay, what is the archive? How does that structure? I mean, you start digging into issues of what it means to produce knowledge. I mean, it gets at a whole bunch of other topics. So for me, it's like, you know, the immersive kind of thing of the real world and video games. It's like, for me, it's important to build physical things because I like the legibility. I mean, in addition to the farmyard kludging around and hacking together things, I like the legibility of a physical thing. And you can kind of invoke, you know, your neo-materialistic theory, thing theory, whatever, about interest in objects. But I like these objects because you can put it in front, you can have it there, and a 3-year-old can kind of look at it and understand, not quite understand it, but it has a certain legibility that is more difficult to do in written things. It's a lot, I see it also as less precise than writing. It's more like with physical objects and with exhibiting things, it's kind of like working with kind of like a sledgehammer, you know. You can build something that has a lot of impact, but it's maybe a little, it can be difficult to make it precise. Whereas if you are doing a paper, it's a little bit more like surgery, you know, that you can really articulate yourself well. And for me, that's a challenge in building stuff that has impact, but then has something to carry through and you know, to has some depth to it. So identify metaphors, recognize what those things exclude, invert it, and then build that inversion. And I like the making because it really embodies, for me, it's an issue of legibility. So if we look at, you know, a desktop, you have a metaphor like this, that the metaphor of the desktop producing a desktop, this concept in computing.
톰 크루즈가 손동작으로
But then you have different interfaces that sort of say, why were we using the desktop all along? Let's rethink how things work. So you see this happening in commercial ventures, people questioning these metaphors or the way of working. And so what I've done in this workshop, and you're welcome to come and drop in and check it out, is to build a set of cards. And this is an earlier prototype than what I'll be showing and working with upstairs. It's looking at inverting well-known technologies. So you kind of draw these cards and you try to use them to brainstorm different ideas. And this is more well suited to people who have a background in studio production. But I did it with media studies students at New School a couple weeks ago. And it was also interesting to just see how people came up with stuff. And I have some blank cards for you to write on. I'm still prototyping this. I'm interested in getting your feedback as to what you think, how you think it could be better. So I'm looking to release this by summer. So by pairing these different things, it's kind of like a prompt to rethink different topics, or you could, substitute your own research interests into this. So it wouldn't have to be this. It could be, just think about the obsolete technology replaced by your current research. Oh, there's the plug. So we're having a workshop today at 4:30 upstairs. And since I'm just close by to all of you here, I wanted to invite you all out. This is what I'm doing at Emily Carr. Is I have a studio space that is interested in looking at how humanities-based modes of critical theory and inquiry can be applied to building technologies. And the things that I really like taking jabs at are efficiency and speed and usability, and kind of stepping back and questioning those, and trying to make more complex, interesting objects. So this is a space that I have. It's on Granville Island. If you're down there, send me an email, come by. I'm just setting up the space now. It's got lots of books and tools and different things. Kind of similar to Gentry's space upstairs. And I'm starting to work with students building projects. And I'll be writing about this process and building studio work. So it's right there. So if you're in Vancouver, come on by. That's Granville Island. And that's it for my talk.